All right, friends, we are back for another chapter of Never Caught, chapter 4, To Move to Philadelphia. And it gets real interesting. Reading this chapter, you start to learn a little bit about how Ona is using her experience and her exposure to these different places that the Washingtons lived and how she's planning her escape. And so the buildups, as I'm learning through each chapter, it gives you so much detail, and then it ends on Ona's thought process on freedom. And this chapter really starts to expose us to the cleverness of who Ona Judge was. Chapter 4 opens up with the summer of 1790. Washington is in the process of shifting from New York to Philadelphia. But on the pit stop to Philadelphia, they go to Mount Vernon for a few months. Ona is now becoming an aunt. Her sister has her niece, and she's starting to realize that her experience in New York versus how she grew up in Mount Vernon is going to start morphing her experience as a Black person in slavery and the idea of freedom and what possibly could exist for her. She's gotten like a taste of it by witnessing free Black people in New York and how they were able to move about. And she sees the difference in how the North and the South treats Black people. Now, Martha, on the other hand, she's coming to grips with the decision of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson by moving this capital to Philadelphia. She was just now getting used to life in New York and her friends and the societal putting on a front to seem like you're better than everybody, blah, blah, blah. And so she's not feeling it. Like, we got to move again. We got to do all this all over again. So she's not happy. Now, people like James Madison was trying to get the capital pushed to the South, and George Washington was on board. George Washington's goal was to get the South to have a federal city built by slave hands, because, you know, they was pro-slavery and they sure was not about to do it. And we see more of how pro-slavery they were by their move. So moving from New York and going to Philly, they ended up bringing more slaves with them. Now get this. I believe in chapter 2, I explained how George Washington really wasn't a fan of white servants. He felt they were unkempt, they were lazy, and they were dirty. And he didn't want them in his presence. So much to the point that he hired this, not hired, but he had this slave by the name of Hercules. And he was this top shelf. He was respected by slaves and some owners. And he used this societal leverage that he had to keep his family together, which is not too often heard of. So like a slave keeping up with certain skills and being the best at what they do kind of gets a little bit of pull with their masters. So he has this son by the name of Richmond, who is now his assistant in the kitchen. George wasn't fond of this, but he was like, it's Hercules. Hercules got all the goods. He know how to season food, so I'll let him come. And y'all remember William, right? William was George Washington's best slave. Like, he had him everywhere. Now, remember, I also said that slaves were only as useful to their owners as long as they were useful. And William's condition after getting hurt with both of his legs had worsened. And so they decided that they were going to leave dear old William in Mount Vernon. So all that stuff about how, you know, I saw him as valuable, I trusted him, and all this other stuff coming from George and how he somewhat respected it. He left George right there in Mount Vernon because he was still Black and he still owned William. Don't get it twisted. He was reminded that he was still Black. So they arrive in Philly, and Philly is in the process. He's in the process of getting this extravagant house built, and unfortunately, no matter how extravagant the house is, he got 25 people living with him. And it's only about 8 or 9 slaves. This also included like relatives of his that he brought with him. And he also had white servants. Now, he didn't like them, but he did have some. Not as many slaves as he did, though. But the house was so crowded, y'all, that they had the grandchildren sleeping in the bed with the slaves because there was not enough room. And most of these slaves slept in the same room as the Washington. So like you would have Martha Washington, who had Ona Judge, who was her trusted bondswoman. But Ona slept in a bed with one of their grandchildren to keep them calm. Unfortunately, because there were no slave quarters at the time, the slaves became cautious about living in the same homes as the slave owners, because many enslaved women were subjected to assault. Now, Ona, on the other hand, she had somewhat of a protection because she was in Martha's room. She also was there with the grandchild in her bed. So she had somewhat of a protection, like they would not assault her as long as the grandchild was there in the bed with her, which is sick, utterly sick. We also learned that slave quarters was not of the best conditions, but it was preferred by some slaves because of this, as well as some sense of privacy. They didn't have to constantly hear their slave masters calling for them when they were trying to get rest. Now, if any of you have ever been to the Whitney Plantation, then you may be familiar with the way that slave quarters were set up in comparison to the master's home. Usually slave quarters were not directly behind the master's home for several reasons. They were usually miles away. So whenever they actually had to leave the slave quarters, they had to trek in swampy water, dangerous grass, you name it. They had to walk in the heat, in the cold, to their master's home. It wasn't like a hop, skip, and a jump. Between the slave quarters and the main house would be the overseer's house. So this is usually where you would have, very rarely you would have a black overseer, but you would have a poor white overseer who was getting paid to keep slaves in line. Hear what I said. They were getting paid. We also learn in the book that slave quarters was a place where those who were enslaved got to gather with one another without having to feel like they had to hush or hide their joy. They could have gatherings. They could meet with other family members. They could tend to their children. They could have a break. So slave quarters was not only a form of protection from slave owners who were there to assault them, but also a place of somewhat peace, in all things considered. A place that was their own, away from their slave masters. It was also a place where they could have some form of community. The chapter then concludes by discussing how Ona Judge is now going to take advantage of these close proximities to her master as well as other white servants. So she gets exposed to seeing how they got paid, how they were able to move around throughout the city, and learn how they were able to leave their owners and make a life for themselves. Ona is very smart, and she is not jumping the gun and just trying to escape. She is plotting her freedom, and she's trying to be smart about it. Now, we often look at our ancestors' experience as slaves in a vacuum, but we never really get exposed to the strategies they had in place to get to freedom. And sometimes that meant enduring so much until they had a strategic plan to escape and not be taken back. Now I can understand why she was never caught, because of how she planned.